So usually I try to incorporate the discussion of the literature in the workshops to try to get you an opportunity to work through it when I'm able to try to help and provide feedback. And usually I try to take away some of the main findings from the readings that are relevant to the larger points that I'm trying to make in the literature in the lectures. But I thought I would spend a little bit of time talking about some of the main findings from each one of these different readings. And I really am fans of the different kinds of research designs that these papers use, both in the kind of high level satellite quantitative kind of data to actually getting on the ground and looking at village dynamics. This photo, by the way, is from the Mote region in Mali that they focus on in the Benjamin et al. Article. So the general kind of questions that relate to food and conflict, the motivating questions that I'm focusing on today are how food production and consumption linked to human security and conflict. I think there's a lot of different compelling ways to try to look at it, a lot of ways that you can think about human security in your own research or in different research agendas that might be of interest to you, as well as those traditional explainers for conflict that we've looked at so far in this class. And I think a lot of the relationships are inherently interactive, as we've seen already. Climate change can combine with political and economic instability, poverty, inequality, and grievances to exacerbate tensions and trigger conflict. So the changes that we're going to look at in the Sahel case example of the Oma River, the other kind of changes that we've seen on the other side of the Sahel in Mali. A lot of agricultural producing regions are susceptible to changes related to climate, and those can have follow-on effects, human security, economic costs, and opportunity that can lead to conflict. We've also seen in this class how important political institutions are, right? I think there's a reason that political science is a bit late to this kind of research agenda, but then there's a lot of work in recent years because the connections are complex. There's a lot of different actors at different levels of analysis that are important, but politics, power, institutions can go a long way to try to explain either the lack of action about certain outcomes, like with climate change, but also actions related to redistribution or even conflict. So poor governance, weak institutions, corruption, weakened capacity. I know a number of you wrote essays on that, and the lack of ability, the restricted ability for states and citizens to respond. Can have an effect on the lack of ability to respond to climate change, as well as just simple scarcity or shocks, right? The Homer-Dixon approach is focusing on both overall levels of scarcity, the pie just gets smaller, as well as how the pie is divided. Certain groups might be getting larger or smaller sizes, and those can reach critical levels if the entire pie is shrinking at the same time, and that can also lead to conflict. And shocks, either through climate reasons. Florida used to see a lot of attention in the press in the United States with the winter. If nights got too cold, a couple nights of freezing temperatures could basically wipe out an entire crop and cost hundreds of millions of dollars in lost revenue to farmers. So these kind of simple shocks, whether weather-wise or political, can have dramatic effects on human security and conflict. Lots of path diagrams in this class because a lot of these relationships are multi-step and involve multiple factors. The UN Environment Program, they also have an effect on how they've also done studies looking at how climate change can affect conflict, environmental migration, and otherwise. But the impacts of the climate change, temperature, rainfall, drought, floods, sea level rise, a bunch of the issues that we've already touched on, are threat multipliers for making people more vulnerable or making resources more or less available, and that can lead to competition and climate, in addition to all those other factors on the left in green, which hopefully should remind you of that Homer-Dixon path diagram that I keep kind of trying to show you, right? That the environmental scarcity can have an effect on food availability. So the first article, the main kind of takeaways from the Benjaminson et al. 2012 piece, which I think is really interesting, is a mixture of quantitative and qualitative inductive research design. You go there and that you figure out what's actually going by actually looking at it. They look at Mali's Mopti region in the Niger River Delta, pretty close to that Matanali Dam that we looked at a couple of weeks ago. They find that 3 structural factors were the most important to explaining this low-level conflict: agricultural encroachment, obstructing the mobility of herders and livestock, something that you can see in the Omo River case in the other side of the Sahel in one of the later videos, but that you can see over millennia, that you have 2 different forms of land use coming into conflict, and once there is overlap or encroachment, that's where conflict is more likely to occur. A political vacuum led to rural actors' opportunistic behavior, right? One of the ways in which you have background structural conditions leading to conflict at certain times but not in others, or in certain places but not in others, is because of these triggers. You have an opportunity to act, including a political vacuum, and that could make it easier. Corruption and rent seeking. Unfortunately, things that are still common around the world, no matter where you look at it. There's an opportunity for unequal distribution, private goods encroaching on the ability to provide public goods, and working outside the system that doesn't necessarily benefit the public good. Moving on to the mistyped this as well. The Rouhani et al. Article. There's more of a theoretical focus on malnutrition, an element of food insecurity and conflict, focused on the other side of the Sahel. I think it's a really creative research design as well. Village level analysis using evidence across borders, Sudan, Ethiopia, and Somalia. A lot of the studies that we've looked at in this class either have a country level unit of analysis, Prio grid. Those grids are often limited to one country or another, but a lot of these peoples in this area as well as other areas, boundaries are less traditionally relevant or more porous, and economic production can provide incentives for people to cross borders. This is something that I've seen just in the movement of peoples from Mexico to Texas on a day-to-day basis, to the border between India and Nepal. One day I accidentally was trying to get into India, and I accidentally walked across the border and didn't realize it. I ended up having to go back to the border checkpoint to get my passport stamped because of the town that basically straddled the border. There wasn't any kind of hard and fast border. So studying in a multi-country approach, I think, especially when they have similar climate conditions, is really creative. And they use satellite data, something that political scientists don't do that much now, though they're starting to kind of look at the links between malnutrition and conflicts. Didn't really show a significant relationship between land degradation and either malnutrition and conflict, or the kind of direct relationships between malnutrition and conflict. And there's this kind of like with the mitigation factors that we've talked about in this class already, right? That you can stay, leave, or try to adapt. That it might take a certain amount of resources to be able to go to conflict, and if you're malnourished, you don't have the capacity to be able to go do that. So it's those areas that might have not necessarily absolutely low malnutrition, but maybe some kind of change, or at a middle level. A couple of other points from the Van Wezel article. We'll get in more detail with these in the workshop. Looking at links between food prices and violence, I included one of the screenshots from this article in the initial trends video. It is an intuitive finding, but one that has implications for government policy. Some anocracies and autocracies, one way at trying to solidify support from their selectorate is by subsidizing either the cost of fuel or the cost of food, because these uprisings can lead to negative political outcomes for leaders. It reminds me of Indonesia in 1998, in which you had food level protests that ended up bringing down a long-serving leader in Suharto. So this article looks at the links between food prices and violence. Food prices, one thing in which you can get pretty transparent and global data on, looking at international prices for different types of food and violence from 1990 to 2011. They find that increases in prices are associated with violence, but also it's important to look at the spillover effects that this actually has. Often we make an assumption that if you're looking at a cell, you're looking at a subnational area, or you're looking at a country, these spillover effects might have an effect on be relevant related to migration, the movement of peoples, but the movement of goods might also be relevant for that. Their results suggest that increases in prices are associated with violence. I already said that. And the substantive effect is relatively small, which I think is something that you might not have necessarily noticed. I'm talking too much, I'm losing my voice. But that is important that I tried to get you to look at in some of the other articles that we've read for this class, that just because something is statistically significant doesn't necessarily mean that it has a large effect in the real world, and that price shocks can have a catalyzing effect or a triggering effect, but those underlying factors are also important, and that this one little thing, there might be other coping mechanisms that can allow these things to not trigger conflict, and that's consistent with other research on the topic. So a few links between these readings, and there's tons, and I mean, if you're doing a paper on this, there's a lot of different directions you can go. There's a lot of literature on various aspects of this, but that substantively, political incentives and the history of the particular area that you're looking at is often of greater substantive importance than the kind of specific agricultural challenges that a place might face, or the short-term changes that they might be going through. Another instance in which you have the climate change impacts having an indirect relationship to conflict, going back to those path diagrams, that it can increase scarcity, which can increase competition or put pressures on the state, and those would have the more direct links, but that it's like the frog boiling experiment, right? That it's turning up the heat and making all kind of other activities more difficult because of these changes. And government's capacity and willingness to act is going to be crucial, right? You have states that might not necessarily have the capacity to be able to do so. There's international organizations, and states can help, as well as musicians. But often it's the governments on the ground that have to be interested in or able to meet the needs of their citizens. And short-term political shocks, like we saw with the South Sudanese case, can trigger famine quite quickly in areas in which there really isn't that kind of buffering capacity, while there might be different challenges in more developed states. So those, a quick kind of run through a couple of the main points from this week's readings, and that they tie into a much broader literature that finds similar things, in which you have these background structural conditions that are sometimes slow moving, but that can have long-term glacial level effects, political challenges and decisions made by leaders, either at the local, village, or national level, as well as clashes that are often between different groups, like herders and pastoralists, or in in urban areas for provision of resources that can also lead to conflict. Most of the research is on rural areas, though you could look at also how food prices could have an effect on protests in urban areas, like in Cairo during the Arab Spring. So those are a few theoretical points. Yeah, I'm gonna get a drink of water or two.